What's up, guys? I wanted to talk about something that is very near and dear to me, and something I've always wanted to talk about, and for some reason I just haven't gotten around to it. But I think it's a good time to do it now. And before I get into it, uh, just gonna give you a little quick oversight on who I am, and maybe you'll get a better picture of why I think the way I think, and just a little bit about me personally. As some of you might know already, I've born, raised, and lived all my life in the South Bronx, New York City. I was born in 1970, so yes, I am 48 years old. And my influences are uh, real heavy on the 70s. That's when I grew up, that's my youth. So I'm heavily influenced by the era. Uh, I love disco music, but that's not really all that I love. I really love all forms of music. I'm just really into music. So it really doesn't matter what genre, not just disco music, but funk, jazz, R&B, soul, uh, classic rock, pretty much anything from that era of the 70s. I can even go back to the late 60s, and I enjoyed music even all the way up to the late 90s, right? So you could pretty much say that since the late 90s to now, for me, music has really declined in general. Uh, I don't really like much at all in of today's era in terms of music. And I really believe that the quality of music is garbage. That's just my opinion, and I don't want anybody to take it personal. And of course, I'm sure a lot of you guys there, love today's music, and there's a lot out there that you love and stuff like that. But this isn't about that. This is about me, my personal tastes. This is, if you really want to get to know who I am, and you know what I think of certain things, in terms of music and stuff. That's what really this is about. Now, you don't have to agree or anything, but just giving you some insight. So, uh, I would say that pretty much after the late 90s, that music was going downhill fast. Now, in the description, I'm going to put two links, right? One discussing what the main topic is, which is the death of disco music, and not really who killed disco, but what killed it, because I think that's even more interesting. So before we get to that, there's a link for Disco Demolition Night, which was pretty much the turning point of what led to the demise of disco music, and also another link to a video from a channel called Thoughty2, and they do a lot of great videos, and a lot of it is really science based, which I love science. So it talks about why today's music is pretty much garbage, and it explains it in scientific terms. So it goes really deep, and it's very interesting. So anyone that really wants to know more about why I feel the way I feel, this video really explains everything in scientific terms better than I ever could. So I left those links in the description box for people who are interested. Maybe you're interested after listening to this video, and maybe not, and that's okay too. So basically, I love all types of music. I really don't have anything that I absolutely cannot listen to. If it's good, it's good. I can listen to it, but my tastes are heavily influenced by the 70s, right? And even well into the 80s. And in my opinion, the best era for music in any genre is the 70s. And that's how I feel. And to this day, that's pretty much the majority of what I listen to. It comes from, I would say, the late 60s to, mid 80s, right? And yeah, there's a lot of good 90s stuff, especially hip hop. That was the golden era. I might mention that later on, but the bottom line is that for me, the 70s is what really grabs at me. And, that's when I grew up. And, just like anyone, you're nostalgic for your youth and you remember things growing up, and those things tend to stay with you. So for me, I've always loved music, and the 70s is really, for me, the pinnacle. So, moving on from that, I want to talk a little bit about disco. I'm not going to go into the history of it or anything like that. That stuff is easily researched. There's a lot of good videos online, and it really goes through the history of disco music. And I highly recommend any of it because there's a lot of good stuff. But basically, just to keep it simple, disco, the genre, it's a stretch to even say it lasted 10 years. 10 years is really a drop in the bucket in time. So you could say disco started more or less in 74, and it was really gone by 82, right? So that's a solid 8-year run. But the decline of disco started in about 1979. And there is a moment in 1979 where something signaled the end of it, right? So disco came along, and for me, I love science. So I'm going to use a little bit of science to describe how I feel about disco. If you know anything about astronomy and the stars, you know that the larger a star is, the brighter it is, and the hotter it is, and those stars do not live as long as most other stars, which are smaller, right? So the bigger the star is, the shorter its lifespan, right? So although it lives billions and billions of years, it's still in bigger scope of time, and when you look at the universe, it's a much smaller time frame compared to other stars. So I look at disco music as one of the biggest stars ever, right? When it was running, it was the biggest, brightest, and hottest thing out there, right? It became so popular, so fast. It felt like it was overnight, right? Because like I said, the era was really less than a decade. And just like anything that becomes really popular really fast, it's going to have a natural backlash from people, right? Even me or anybody else, some things that become really popular overnight just rub people the wrong way. If for no other reason, just from the fact that it's in your face constantly, right? So that's how I see disco. It was just so big, so bright, and it just got popular so fast. It felt like it happened overnight, and that, people have a natural tendency to, feel something negative towards something like that. So at some point in the late 70s, there was a movement, what they called the disco sucks movement. You started seeing people wearing t-shirts that said disco sucks and all this other stuff because it was just everywhere. And people didn't like it, and they kind of wanted it to go away. So what I find interesting when it comes to the disco genre in history, it's the fact that we're actually talking about an entire genre of music that was killed off, that died, that no longer really exists. And when I say no longer exists or died, I mean that nobody is producing real disco anymore. That stuff just doesn't happen. It never came back. You have the library of work that existed, and that will always be with us, but it just stopped. And I think that when you think of America and you think of what happened, and I'm referring to something called Disco Demolition Night, and that happened in 1979 on Comiskey Park, where the Chicago White Sox used to play. It was a real dump back in the day, but a DJ, I don't remember his name, but if you check out the link, you'll see everything. It was some doofus guy from some never heard from radio station, and he was part of this Disco Sucks movement. And actually, it was more about self-promotion. It was just some guy trying to make a name for himself, and this was a vehicle that he used to do that. And back then, he somehow set up this Disco Demolition Night. And the idea was for people to bring all of their disco records to the park, and they would pile them up in the middle of the field. And they would literally blow up the records, okay, with explosives. So stop and think about that for a second. And what I find so unbelievable is that something like that could happen in America. And what I'm really referring to is more of a social, political viewpoint. That if you hear about somebody who wants to burn books, that's something that you only hear about in an authoritarian regime, a dictatorship. You don't really hear about stuff like that in a free-thinking society, in a country that prides itself in freedom of speech. We're America. You're not supposed to destroy ideas, books, music. That is something that always bothered me. And I've always thought about how people came to accept such a thing so easily. There was no pushback. There was nobody that said, you know what, this isn't a good idea. This is very un-American. Now, if you don't like disco music, that's fine. This is a free country. You don't have to like it. There are songs I don't like or I've hated. But to actively go out of your way to destroy music as a symbol, as a form of symbolism, to me, it's one of the low points in our history, and it's something nobody really talks about. It was just glossed over, and I always found that to be something incredible, that it really happened. Aside from that, the idea that you could even have the concept of having thousands and thousands of people bring records to a stadium and literally blow it up with explosives. Just besides the social political viewpoint, just the thought of blowing something up at a ball field, how could that go well? It's like you would think that people would say, this doesn't sound safe. It just sounds like a stupid idea. We're not gonna sign off on this, right? But that's the amazing thing, that besides how easily people signed off on the idea of destroying music or records as a symbolism, how easily people went along with just the idea of blowing shit up at Comiskey Park. It's like, it's just odd, certain things that really happened in history, and I just find it incredible. And I always thought that was a very low point, just a real sad time in our society, just to see something like that happen, that people would feel that inspired, that much passion to go out of their way to blow music up, just destroy records, right? Now, you can't destroy music in its entirety because it will always exist, right? But remember, this was 1979, and it was vinyl albums. You know, we weren't thinking of the future and MP3s and you know, digital music and stuff like that. It was a different time. So this had even more symbolism back then. You know, it was even more dangerous because you're physically destroying, you know, music. So I always thought that was a sad thing to happen. I thought that the fact that this is a free country, that we actually just went along with something like that, it says something about our society. And in all honesty, it should make people think about all the shit that's happening today, right in front of our faces, that you know deep inside are wrong. But very few people speak out. And you just go along with it. And it's like, what the fuck happened to our rights, to freedom of speech? And now it's like, hey, if you don't like something, you can just shut it down one way or another. And I think it's dangerous, you know. But I don't want to get too far into that or into that aspect. This is really about the disco genre and what happened to it. So you can check out the video. You can see Disco Demolition Night, what happened. And in either case, it turned out to be an out-of-control disaster, which was something that should have been predictable. I mean, they should have never signed off on such a thing, even if you were okay with the symbolism of destroying ideas and music. You know, this is no different than book burning, right? Something we as Americans frown upon when other countries and societies do it. And we're like, wow, you know, aren't we lucky that we had freedom of speech and stuff like that? And we're such an open and accepting society, except that we're really not. So 1979, that's to me what signaled the downfall. Now, disco music did not die on that night, but it was a real turning point in history. Now, this whole Disco Sucks movement, with people wearing Disco Sucks t-shirts, that led to this event at Comiskey Park, this was coming slowly but surely, right? Because there was a backlash. You always heard people on the radio or calling into the radio stations, right, complaining about disco. And, you know, like I said, it became so popular overnight. What started off in just urban cities like New York, and then it spread out to other cities. It was a whole cultural movement. And I think this is another thing that people should keep in mind. It really wasn't about how the music itself was terrible. It was what it represented. The culture that it represented. Okay? The freedom that it represented. Because disco music and what came with it, it was about unity, right? There wasn't really a big message attached to it except love, right? Most of the music was about love or dancing and just having a good time. There was no other real deep message in the music. So, if anything, it was even more harmless as music than rap music, you know, later on, you know, or rock and roll when it first really took hold in the 50s, right? A lot of people felt threatened, you know. It felt like a big middle finger to the establishment, to the man, as they used to say. Disco music was more about just having a good time, forgetting about your problems. When the weekend came, you wanted to go dancing to the clubs, right? There wasn't even really a thing of nightclubs, right? Nightclubs really took, I'm not saying it didn't exist, but it really became something huge with the disco era. And nightclubs were popping up everywhere. And the problem was, right, one, these clubs were starting to pop up in rural areas, in areas where there wasn't a lot of diversity, right? The disco culture is a melting pot, right? I grew up and lived all my life in New York, so I'm used to different cultures. I'm used to different ways of thinking, different cultures. People from all over the world congregate to New York, which is why we're known as a melting pot. And I've seen just about everything there is to see. New York really exposes you to everything, right? So I'm not telling you that New Yorkers are more tolerant than everyone else, but in general, right? We're just used to different thoughts, different people, different cultures in close proximity to each other. Whereas you go to other rural places across the country and you don't have that kind of diversity. And most people are in a bubble. And they all kind of look the same, talk the same. They all believe in the same things. So I don't want to get too descriptive with it because I don't want people to take things the wrong way. But that's the way the country is. You know, when you go to the middle of the country or the South, you know, you do see more of a bubble type of environment. You know, there just isn't a big mix of different cultures and people. So when these places started getting what they would consider infiltrated by disco, and like I said, it wasn't so much about the actual music, but what it came with it, what it represented, which is a culture, different cultures, all getting along, right? Because there was no place more diverse and where people got along more than at a disco club, where everybody from all walks of life were sharing the same space because nobody cared who you was, nobody cared if you were gay, straight, if you were a Puerto Rican, black, white. It doesn't matter where you were from. When you went to the club, you were all there. You were united under just this party atmosphere. That's all people cared about. Let's get along. Let's have a good time. Let's dance. And that is, believe it or not, that's threatening to a lot of people. When you think that's coming to your town, and your town is not really the most diverse place, you don't want that in your town, right? Because unfortunately, yes, we do live in a very segregated society when you look at certain places. And a lot of people don't like to talk about it, don't want to hear it, get upset when you bring it up. Things like racism or homophobia, whatever the case is. Anything that's different than you, as much as cultured as we think we are in America, we're really not. And the disco movement, or the genre, that's what it brought with it. It was just about having a good time, and nobody really cared about who you were, where you came from. When you were at the club, you were there for a good time. You didn't have, you didn't see that racism. You didn't see the homophobia. You didn't see all the other things that you see in other society, in other environments, I should say. So that was a threat to people, and I think that's really when the Disco Sucks movement started, because a lot of these people, they were all, if you look at them, they were all from the same backgrounds and communities, and they all had this similar thinking, and you know what I'm talking about, but they didn't want this, and that was a threat to them. They didn't want disco clubs popping up in their neighborhoods and stuff, because they knew that what comes with it is that other people who stay in their closeted societies or don't really go out and they don't want all this mix with all these cultures. And that's honestly what led to the demise of the disco genre. It really wasn't the music itself, because here's another point I'm going to make. Disco is really the only genre of music to ever completely die. Now, you can make a case for folk music and stuff like that, but that stuff was never really mainstream, right? It was never really popular. You know, all other forms of music have survived, and they've changed, right? So, if disco still existed today and there was people still making disco, it definitely wouldn't sound exactly like it sounded in the 70s. It would have evolved into something, right? Just like all forms of music change, it would have changed too. But I, for one, would have been really interested to know how it would have evolved. Also, there was a lot of great artists and musicians that felt they didn't want to be attached to disco. They didn't want to be known as a disco artist. So they went out of their way to leave the genre. They just wanted to go and branch out to something else because disco music, especially in the late 70s, after that Disco Demolition event, it was really like something that was frowned upon. So if you are a talented singer or musician, you don't want to go in that direction. You know, you were kind of shunned away from that. And that's the sad part, because I think we really missed out on some really great disco music. Think of all the great disco that could have been into the 80s, right? Which we saw a lot of great music in the 80s, right? I love the 70s, but the 80s was great too. There was a lot of really great musicians and artists that came along. But a lot of what could have been in terms of disco music, it's, what could have been, but never was. And I think that was what was really sad. And like I said, it's the only genre of music that was literally killed off. And I think that's terrible. I mean, in America, that so many people actually got together to actively destroy a genre of music because they were so threatened by the culture and the diversity behind it. I think it's sad, and I think not enough was said about it. That's one of the reasons that I've always wanted to talk about it. And I hope that I opened up some people's eyes to, what happened to disco. And it really wasn't about who killed disco, because I think it's evident that, who kind of did it and which groups of people did it. But more importantly, what killed disco. Because it wasn't just a backlash about people not liking a particular type of music. Because lots of people hate rap. Lots of people hate other genres of music. They hate country. They hate rock. They hate this. They hate that. Nobody's out destroying records or trying to destroy an entire genre of music. Nobody's doing that. If you don't like certain music, you just don't listen to it. You stay away from it. Seems simple enough. But when it came to disco, and this is why I compare it to a star. A big, bright star, right? And another thing about the biggest, brightest stars in the universe, they die violent deaths. Whereas smaller stars kind of fizzle out. They'll become like a red giant or a white dwarf or something, and they just slowly through time dissipate. The biggest stars actually explode in what's called a supernova. And I think there's a lot of symbolism in comparing disco music to a big, bright star that goes supernova. And Disco Demolition Night, which literally had disco records being blown up. There's a lot of similarities there. And I think the threat of disco, it became so popular so fast, people couldn't handle it and what came with it. And that, I thought, was a more interesting thing to discuss or talk about, because that's something that very few people have ever talked about, and people still to this day really don't touch that subject. And they just kind of accepted the fact that an entire genre of music just went away. Now, I will say this. After disco pretty much just went away, we did get other forms of dance music that did you could say uh, were descendants of disco. Now, and one in particular is house music. Those of you who don't know, house music is similar to disco and party type music and stuff. And it started in the it's really started just about the time disco died. And it pretty much, it's widely considered that it started in Chicago, and they used to call it garage music and stuff. But the earliest house music was really remixes of disco songs, old disco music. So in a way, in a small way, you could make the case that disco lives on or lived on for some time through house music and later into techno music and stuff like that. I can't get into all that stuff because that's another branch of music history. But disco music itself as a genre, I think it's one of the saddest times in American history that something like that could happen, and that we allowed it to happen, and that so many people were just okay with it and didn't really push back on it and just accepted it. And, it's sad. But I continue to be a huge disco fan. I love disco music. And I would say 95% of the music that I have is all from the late 60s to the 80s, right? And most of it is from the 70s. And what I consider in any genre, it doesn't matter if it's rock, funk, jazz, soul, R&B, or disco, or fusion, right? There's some weird jazz, fusion, funk type of music that I love. And just, to me, anything from the 70s just sounds fantastic. That, for me, is the best era of music. And one more thing I want to say about disco as a genre, as music. I would put disco music up against any other form of music in history in terms of musical arrangement. I'm talking about the complexity of the musical arrangement. It's on par with anything that's ever existed. When you really break down the musical arrangements, I put it up there. Especially today, most music is very generic. It's horrible. I don't want to get into too much about why today's music sucks. That's why I put a link in the description, and that I highly recommend to anybody who's interested. And I promise you watch that video, and you'll walk away with a whole new insight on just music in general. As far as who my favorite artists are or in history, I don't want to break it down to like, oh, this is my number one favorite, because whenever you think about that, it kind of changes, and it's hard to pinpoint. But I can tell you that I'm heavily influenced, and I love some of my favorite acts, the Bee Gees, Lonnie Liston Smith. Okay, now I'm talking about some jazz, funk, fusion type music. And I would say tied for the top two, my favorite all-time music came from Stevie Wonder and Barry White, who I consider one of the most underrated artists in music history. This man was a music genius. And I can make a video just talking about Barry White, and I'm not going to do it, but I am a huge fan. And one of my biggest regrets is that I never got to see him in concert. Or Stevie Wonder, or Earth, Wind and Fire, another huge influence in my life in terms of music. Isley Brothers, Al Green, Teddy Pendergrass. There's too many to get into, but as you can see, the large majority of these people, their heyday was in the 70s, and that's the type of music I love and listen to, and that is my biggest influences. So in terms of music, I hope you learned a little something about me, disco music, the history, and I hope you guys check out the links that I put in there. I think they're very insightful, and it gives you a better understanding of really what happened with the genre. And just think about it. Think about the fact that there was at one time a form of music that was purposely killed off by people in America. That something like that could actually happen in America till this day blows my mind. But it is a reminder for people to really keep your eyes open and watch what's happening around you in society, because you can't just stand by silently and watch, America degrade as a society with all the things we're seeing. And don't fool yourself. You do not have all the rights you think you have, and they're being stripped away every day. And people whose rights are being violated, they might be different from you. They may not look like you. They may not come from the same place you come from. But just as you might feel safe that it's not happening to you, it can happen to you at some point. It's just something to think about. Okay? So I don't think I got too deep into politics or social commentary there, so I don't see any reason why anyone should be offended. But as always, I try to keep everything 100% honest. That's the way I am. And a lot of people may not like certain things I have to say, but I feel very confident that even as an opinion, all right, it's a well thought out opinion, and it does come from observation and experience and really looking at facts. Okay? So you don't have to like it or agree with it, but I hope you respect it. And I hope that, it's more importantly for people who, even if you don't agree with something or an idea or whatever, at least be open enough to look further into it. And you'd be surprised. Maybe you'll think differently or see something in a different way. And, there's nothing wrong with that. There are things in life that I used to believe or think, and as time, moved on and I grew and evolved, I see things differently now than I did when I was much younger. So that's not something to be afraid of or ashamed of. Being open to new ideas or things that you may not think you agree with, but be more open to it. There's nothing wrong with that. And as Americans, as supposed free-thinking society, and people that support that, you should try harder to be more open to, things that are different. So I'm going to leave it at that. I know the video was long, and I hope that those of you who really sat through it maybe walk away thinking different or with some new insight. And I really do hope you guys check out those videos and let me know what you think. So I hope you got something out of it, and thanks for listening. I'll see you guys around.